Welcome, those of you who are interested in hearing more. We are recording this, so welcome to those of you who are watching later. Anyways, I thought it would be a good idea just to kind of get into a bit more of the history of this, partly because some of the history of the Nicene Creed is very misunderstood. Some of you might remember the Da Vinci Code. You guys remember that? Here's a little quote from the Da Vinci Code to start. This Professor Teebing is saying this. Constantine needed to strengthen the new Christian tradition and held a famous ecumenical gathering known as the Council of Nicaea. Sophie had only heard this insofar as it being the birthplace of the Nicene Creed. At this gathering, Teebing said, many aspects of Christianity were debated and voted upon: the date of Easter, the role of bishops, the administration of the sacraments, and of course, the divinity of Christ. I don't follow. His divinity? Said Sophie. My dear, Teebing declared, until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless and a mortal. Not the Son of God? Right, said Teebing. Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was only officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea. Hold on. So you're saying Jesus' divinity was the result of a vote? And a relatively close one at that, Teebing added. Anyways, now I read that just in jest mostly because it's so absurd. Almost everything in that is a lie, and yet it's probably what most people would assume, I would think, if they don't look into it. Now, before the Council of Nicaea, there had been a number of different church councils. Is this one on? Sorry, getting an echo in here. Anyways. So before there was a number of councils. You probably famously know the Council of Jerusalem in AD 49 that we see in Acts 15, possibly also in Galatians 2. There's a debate about how Christians and Jewish Christians are to relate to the Mosaic Law. And they're asked to do two things, right? Not to eat food that is associated with idolatry and a kind of bestial eating that we would see in the Gentile world, and to refrain from sexual immorality. So some debates never end. But so that's Jerusalem, kind of sets the precedent for how the church should get along in general. Later on, we see a council in Rome, AD 144. They met to talk about this heretic named Marcion, who was saying that the Old Testament God and the New Testament God were different. So that was AD 144. Then we see one in Carthage around 220, debating whether or not, if you were baptized by a heretic, if your baptism was still valid and whether you should get rebaptized. Then we see in Iconium, 10 years later, they're talking about a particular teacher named Montanus who was like this. Kind of think about like an ancient charismatic person who said that his teaching was the same authority as the apostles. And could somebody close those doors? It's a little bit loud. Same as the apostles, and that he should be treated like somebody who is inspired by the Holy Spirit. At one point, even claiming to be the incarnation of the Holy Spirit. Okay, he is renounced way back then in 320. And then there's some other councils. We don't need to go over them all, but there's lots, different ones. But they're kind of more localized to local issues. And it's kind of difficult to have a real centralized authority when you're in a church that is illegal to function, right? So it's illegal to be a Christian up until the time of Constantine. And once Constantine makes Christianity legal with the Edict of Milan in 313, then Christians are actually allowed to do things. And Constantine kind of famously takes on Christianity for himself. And so he calls the Council of Nicaea based on this argument that's happening in Alexandria. So now the argument in Alexandria is between two people, the bishop of Alexandria, Alexander, and particularly his kind kind of like sidekick theologian Athanasius, who eventually becomes the Bishop of Alexandria later on after the Council of Nicaea, and this prominent teacher, Arius. So let's talk about who is Arius, this guy who gets slapped by Santa. So it's as we look at history, sometimes if you get this kind of like bird's eye view of church history, it's easy to consider Arius this like, scheming, conniving heretic that's trying to ruin everything. And sometimes he's pictured in that way, right? But that's not who he is. He's this kind of intellectual, philosophical teacher, and he works in what would be the equivalent of the seminary in Alexandria. And he's trying to understand how the gray areas of these things kind of fit together. So remember, because the church wasn't really able to meet and define these things carefully, there was still some question about exactly how all these things work together perfectly, right? So again, it's not like today where you can just send out an email and, hey, this is what we believe, and everybody gets it. No, it's not like that. So it's messier. And even what we're talking about today has more generalities. The specifics are always more messy. So anyways, the world that Arius is in is also defining what church authority looks like. Okay? So again, it wasn't clear who's in charge and how that authority functions in this period in the church. Now, it is developing, right? We can speak about bishops and even archbishops, even before Constantine. But what they are and what their authority is still questionable. We're still talking about church authority today. So it's something that's always kind of being defined depending on the situation that the church finds itself in. But in Alexandria at this time, there's kind of two parties that are vying for control. Okay, now that makes it sound like it's this big, corrupted power struggle. But don't think about it that way. Think about it more just like who has the right to define things. Okay, and whose teaching should be listened to above others. It's not necessarily nefarious, is what I mean. So there's these two kind of roles. One, the bishop, right, who's kind of like a senior pastor over a bunch of satellite churches. That's kind of like today. And then you have this teacher or catechist or however you want to say it, who is involved in training pastors later on, right? So the teacher is able to be a little bit more scientific, a little more philosophical. They're dealing with future leaders, and so they can speak about things in ways that don't necessarily have to relate to the day-to-day life of the church, but can kind of speak about things in a more abstract way, right? And so you can see how that would lend itself to being more exploring the gray areas of things and trying to do that, right? Just like today. And then you have a pastor, like a bishop, whose day-to-day life is dealing with the life of the church and the worship and all those kinds of things, and is going to be more concerned to make sure that you're maintaining the teaching beforehand, and to make sure that you are incorporating the worship and all those kinds of things. So they're just kind of different roles, right? But both of these people are kind of jockeying for position in terms of who's able to define things. Now, you can see it today, like a seminary professor and a senior pastor, right? Sometimes those people argue with each other. If you go to Synod today, you're going to see some of that, okay? Now, so this is Arius. He's in that kind of role. So what is he teaching? So in his era, the previous discussions were all about what does it mean for God to be God? Okay, what does it mean for God to be God? How do we understand this perfect divine nature? And a lot of the philosophical discussions at that time were seeking to understand that, right? This distinction between creature and creator. What does it mean for this perfect being to exist? Okay, so even non-Christian philosophers are thinking about this. Guys like Plotinus, who founded the school of Neoplatonism. But Christians are kind of in that mix too. Okay, and they're talking with each other, and they're trying to figure this out and be as precise as they possibly can. And so he is really focusing on this issue of divine unity. And so when you start bringing in the Son and all this, then it starts to be like, okay, well, how does that function, right? We talked about this in the sermon this morning. How does this unchangeable, perfect nature really interact with creation at all? Some of these philosophers are saying that there needs to be a series of intermediaries before any of those intermediaries even contact with creation because of the unchangeable nature. So, yeah. So if God is this purely simple being and he can't be divided, how does that make sense? So also what Arius is concerned to talk about is if God is absolutely free and not constrained by anything, how can we have this process of eternal generation that we talked about this morning? Doesn't that constrain God in some way? If God is perfectly free and he can do anything, he's not constrained by any kind of limits, then isn't that eternal generation a limitation on God that we are imposing on him? And he said that's inappropriate. So that was another aspect of the concern that it's a little more philosophical. So, and throughout all this, there's also a question about what does salvation mean? Now, if Jesus is a creature, then we think about him more as an example rather than this perfect divine sacrifice, right? And so some people were understanding salvation to what we really require is a good example of what it means to live faithfully, and that's what salvation is, living faithfully. But the Orthodox were saying, no, salvation has more to do with being saved, like we are being taken and we don't contribute anything to it, okay? So you can kind of see how if you have a creature who works towards salvation, even if that is self-sacrifice and all that, even if it is this exalted creature, there is a kind of different emphasis on salvation altogether. Is that clear? You can stop me whenever and ask a question, by the way. This isn't a sermon. Yeah. So that's kind of what is driving Arius's opinions. So who is this Athanasius? Athanasius is kind of a interesting character in church history. His nickname was the Black Dwarf. So in Alexandria is kind of, Alexandria is right at the head of the Nile. So right where Mesopotamia meets. It was a city that was founded by Alexander the Great, hence the name. But it was kind of a mixing pot of different ethnicities and things, kind of a real urban center. And Athanasius comes from the lower classes, very dark-skinned African people coming up from the south. And so he's one of these people. Little guy, little black guy, okay? Now he is incredibly tenacious. It would be one of these characters. A Black Dwarf really characterizes him. Like, think about this like little tenacious guy who just refuses to say no, kind of thing. He shuns all the pomp and privilege that is being given to bishops at this time as Christianity is becoming the recognized religion of the Roman Empire. He spends most of his time hanging out with these monks in the desert who are intentionally shunning this pomp and privilege. So he's this kind of tenacious guy who hates, being having all this riches and things like that. He writes this best-selling book, which is a life of one of these desert fathers, we call them, these monks in the desert, called the Life of Saint Anthony, which I recommend reading. It's very interesting. It's kind of one of the first Christian bestsellers that comes out after the New Testament. Kind of changes the way that a lot of Christians understand what the Christian life should look like, and it's very important in this time period. So anyways, Athanasius writes this. His theology is kind of the one that sets the standard for what it means to to understand the Nicene Creed. And so after the Council of Nicaea, he kind of grows in prominence, and we'll look at that in a bit. So anyways, these are these two people kind of vying for the ears of everybody in the church, right? So the Council of Nicaea comes finally, like I said, it was called by Constantine to deal with the problem that Arius is having in this church in Alexandria. This is kind of a big relief for a lot of the church leaders. You can imagine, right? Like, you really wanted to have a gathering like this since the beginning, but you couldn't, because you couldn't really get together, because then you're all together, somebody could come in there and just kill you all. So obviously you wouldn't want to do that. And not only are these people able to meet, they're actually being promoted to meet. Your travel expenses are being covered by the emperor. He's giving you a big hall. He's going to be there in person. This is a huge turn for the church, right? It's kind of what we call a watershed moment. Things were building up to this, and then all of a sudden it kind of bursts, and you see a different kind of way to do church. Even though, like I said, there were lots of other councils before, there was a precedent for this. So, now, when we think about Nicaea, we think about the Nicene Creed. But it's important to remember that the Nicene Creed wasn't the goal of Nicaea to begin with. They weren't meeting to write a creed. They wrote the creed as a means to make sure that other people wouldn't teach like Arius anymore. Okay? They weren't thinking that they were going to write something that was going to be recited in churches for the next 2,000 years or 1,700 years up until now. They thought, we're just writing something as a statement that this guy can't sign, so basically it deposes him. Okay. Now, they do a really good job. When they're writing it, they take the baptismal formulas that had been said earlier on, like what we say in our Apostles' Creed, and they add things to it to clarify what it means for the Son to be the Son. Now, actually, what we say now in church comes from 381, not 325. So it's a bit of a misnomer when I say this is the 1700th anniversary of the Nicene Creed, because what we're saying is actually comes at the Council of Constantinople, which is an affirmation of the Nicene Creed, and then again kind of adding a little bit to it to make it comprehensible to the time that it's in. But the theology and the main part of the creed that we see in Nicaea comes to 381, and then we get this Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, but nobody calls it that because it's a bit of a mouthful. So, anyways, there's some differences between 325 and 381. The biggest difference is there at the end of the creed there was this anathemas. Have you guys ever heard that term, anathema, before? Basically, it's like, if anybody says these things, they're going to hell. Okay? That's the cursed be the person. That's what anathema means. Cursed be the person who says this. And so what they finish it, that we don't say anymore in church, and because the Nicene Creed started to be said in church, it became a little bit, it's not a very nice thing to do, to, damn people to hell in church every Sunday. So they got rid of it, even though the heart of it is still there. So they say, as for those who say when he was not, and before he was being born he was not, and that he came into existence out of nothing, or to assert that the Son of God is from a different hypostasis or substance, or is created, or is subject to alteration or change, these the Catholic Church anathematizes. So that was in the original Creed of Nicaea. Okay, so you can see in this last statement, remember that quote that I gave from Arius, they're basically denouncing point by point what his main points were. Okay, so there's lots of other tensions in the church at this time, but this one kind of rose to the top as the biggest one. If you read the Nicene, so we have the canons of of Nicaea. So the creed is part of that, but there's also other topics that they address, and you can read that online if you search for it. But there's lots of other things that are going on in the church, as you might imagine. So between 325 and 381 is this kind of really important era. Okay. Now we would probably think, the council met, they decided, everyone's like, we're done, see you later, right? No, that's not what happened at all. Sometimes we kind of assume that because we have this creed, right? Okay, now it's settled. But actually, the years between 325 and 381 were very tumultuous time for the church. And it's kind of exemplified in this bishop, Eusebius of Caesarea. Okay, anybody heard that name before? He wrote the first church history, Eusebius. So you can still read it. I've got it on my shelf. Interesting guy, Eusebius. He was probably the most prominent bishop in the Roman Empire at that time. He's in Caesarea, which is kind of on the seaboard in Palestine, and he's in this really prominent place. He becomes kind of like the bishop for the emperor, like kind of the emperor's right-hand man, and he's often described as being a little bit too political. He writes these kind of really grand statements of who the emperor is and what he's like, very political. Modern people often critique him for being kind of wishy-washy. Now, some of you, if you've ever dealt with church politics, been to classis or synod or something like that, you know, there's usually like a group on one side and a group on the other, and then a bunch of people in the middle. Now, when you have a leader from that group in the middle, those can be sometimes the most dangerous people in church history when you look at church history in general, because they don't really care so much about defining things carefully. What they care about is let's all get along, okay? And throughout church history, you see time and time again people like this, and they think they're helping, but anyways, just makes a big mess of everything. Now, Eusebius is one of these guys. So throughout his writings over this period, this 50-year period, you see him flip-flopping back and forth between Arius' position and Athanasius' position, okay? And he ends up kind of coming around to the Nicene option when it becomes politically convenient, okay? But his life shows a little bit of the conversation at this time. From emperor to emperor, you would have one who was very pro-Arian and one who was very pro-Nicene, and they would persecute the church in that way. So Athanasius himself is exiled 8 times throughout his life because he's this kind of the poster child for Nicaea, and every time there's an Arian bishop or Arian emperor, he gets kicked out and he has to flee and for his life. Right? So this kind of idea that the Constantine picked the doctrine and then everybody else had to fall in line is just ridiculous. Like when you look at the history of even Athanasius' own life, he could have died many times for his beliefs. And So anyways, now when I say it goes flip-flopped, it wasn't exactly flip-flopping between Arius' opinion and Athanasius' opinion. What it was is there was this discussion about the term homoousios. Okay, so I said it earlier today. The same substance, homo, same, ousia, essence, substance. So homoousios, and there were some people in the church, even people who were people who we would look at now as like being really orthodox in their teaching, kind of wondering whether or not it would be better to say homoiousios rather than homoousios, because like substance, homoi, it makes it seem like, okay, well, we're not saying they are the same thing, okay? So now, remember, like I said, the big problem before Nicaea was that there were some people teaching that their God was essentially wearing different masks, right? So if you say homoousios, then it kind of sounds like you're saying that, okay? And there was even a prominent bishop at Nicaea, Marcellus of Ancyra, who was promoting that view, even a century after it had been kind of dismissed. So they were kind of questioning, okay, is that the right word to use? Is it not? And so when you look at the flip-flopping, there's a lot of politics involved in that. And, that's the nature of the church, kind of happens. Anyways, so is the homoousios the right word to use? There's also a question about the word homoousios. There were some heretics in previous centuries who had used that term in different ways, which kind of tainted the term. And so people were pointed at this term and be like, is that really the one we want to use? Because doesn't that remind you of this person and their teaching? Some of the ways it was used, there were these teachers who said that our election, so like our being chosen by God to be saved, was based on our nature. And they said those who are spiritual have the same nature as God, homoousios, as God. And so they said of themselves that they had the same nature as God. Okay? And that's why God saved them. And that's why they chose God. So there's that group. They were dismissed a century beforehand, but they used this word. And so it kind of like made the word a little bit icky, right? And then I guess Marsilius really liked the term. And so there was this kind of like, do we really want to use it or not? But eventually it was decided that even though it could be misunderstood, the other words that we could use misunderstand it even more. So whenever you're talking about God, you have to be qualified. There's qualifications to every statement you make because you're dealing with this mystery, right? So any language that we use has to be very careful and has to be defined in one way and not in another. So they decided by around 360, so about 25, 30 years after the Council of Nicaea, then we start seeing bishops and teachers using this term as a marker of orthodoxy. Okay? And then by the Council of Constantinople, which was dealing with what does it mean for the Son to have two natures, they say the Nicene Creed that we say now as something for church to be used. So that's basically all I got to say about that. Is there any questions? Okay, well, so the question is, for those watching later, does the Apostles' Creed precede the Nicene Creed or not? Now, that's a bit of a complicated question. So, what do we mean by the Apostles' Creed? So there are statements that are very similar to the Apostles' Creed, 2nd century, 180, 160. Very similar. They're not the exact wording of the Apostles' Creed, but the Apostles' Creed is basically a creedal version of this baptismal questioning, right? What do you believe about God the Father? I believe the God Father, Almighty Son of God, right? So that's what you would say when you're getting baptized, right? And so they turned that into a creed. So basically, when was that creed happened? Well, the earliest version we have of that baptismal formula turned into a creed in the West was around not 1200, but around like 600, 800, somewhere in there. Again, it's a little bit sticky because it's not like you have a council who's defining something, right? You have churches in the West who are, writing their worship services, and that's kind of how you get this, right? Because it makes sense to say something altogether, and so that you get this kind of like creedal formula, which is a little bit simpler than the Nicene Creed, but fit to a worship service. So again, the Nicene Creed looks a whole lot like the Apostles' Creed, right? It's just got more language to deal with a certain issue. And so what had happened, most likely, was one of the bishops, one of the leading bishops, they think this bishop from Spain, Horosius of Cordova, basically said, hey, when we're doing this baptismal thing, this is what we say. And everyone's like, oh yeah, we do something similar to that. And he's like, yeah, this is our writing. So let's write that, and then let's say, God of God, all that kind of extra stuff, right? That's basically what happened. Again, you have to remember that the church wasn't able to make these decisions in synod and meeting annually, right? So they're just kind of making do with the situation that they had. But it would be a misnomer to say that the Apostles' Creed, came from the Middle Ages. So, yeah. Any other question? Yeah. So I think some of the latest phrases that we see, like he descended into hell, is like one of the latest phrases we see in the Apostles' Creed. I can't remember exactly when we find that in what writing, but I think it was around the 6th century, like 500 somewhere. Yeah. I could be wrong on exacts, but I have it in my catechism notes. So, yeah. But that it's a bit of a misnomer to say that, again, because the vast majority of the Apostles' Creed is found very early. And even when they're talking about it in the 3rd century, they're talking about it like something that's very ancient. So it's even if we don't find the exact wording in that way, the vast majority of it and the teaching of it is very ancient, and the idea that you need to have something like this is very ancient. So, any other questions? Any questions on any points of the creed? Like if you look at it and you say, oh, what does that mean? Like, why do they say that? Okay. Yeah. Catholic. Yeah. Catholic just means universal. So it gets kind of confusing because there is a church, that denomination, that brands itself as Catholic, right? But Catholic just simply means universal, like the church throughout the whole world from across time, right? That's what it means when we say Catholic. It doesn't mean, those who are submitting to the Pope, which, yeah. So again, that's kind of confusing. Yeah, so I would usually say the Roman Church when I'm talking about the Catholic Church, so that I don't. Early reformers would call themselves Reformed Catholics, basically recognizing that they're a part of the universal church, but they are reforming it. So, yeah. But it is an important concept, and there's a reason why we have it in the Creed, because we should recognize that we are a part of something that's huge, right, and beyond us. And when we make these confessions, we aren't doing that just on behalf of our local church, but we're doing that on behalf of a universal thing that started from the very beginning. Yeah. Yeah, so the Nicene Creed has like the 4 marks of the church: one, holy, apostolic, Catholic. And yeah, so those kind of define what it means for a church to be a church, right? Now, depending on what denomination you're in, you're going to define those in different ways. In the Reformed tradition, we define the unity as not being a visible unity, right? But that it's an invisible unity of those who are elect in Christ. That's what it means to be a part of the Catholic Church, to be elect in Christ. That's not something that we see. I can't see whether or not you're saved. But a Roman Catholic would say, well, if you are in communion with the Pope, that means you are a part of the Catholic Church, right? And so that would be a big difference between the two of us. Again, that's a simplification, but yeah. And then apostolic. So the Roman Catholic Church would say to be a part of the apostolic church would be to be under a bishop who can trace his lineage back to the apostles. Okay, so Peter is the first pope, they say, and then Peter he handed that mantle down to Clement, and Clement handed that down to whoever, and down they could trace the list all the way down to Leo the 13th or whatever his name is now, right? And so that's what they call apostolic succession, and that's what it means to be a part of the apostolic church, and that's how they would understand that from the creed. But we would say, no, what it means to be a part of the apostolic church is to maintain the teaching of the apostles. So a Reformed person would say, we're apostolic, we hold the teaching of the apostles, so yeah. And then the other marks, holiness, they would be kind of defined in a similar way, but yeah. But those two would be kind of how we would differ from Reformed to Roman Catholic. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the Athanasian Creed is a bit of a misnomer. So it follows Athanasius theology, but the first time we see the Athanasian Creed is in like a century after Athanasius' death. So he didn't write it so much as inspired it, you could put it that way. It probably comes from a bishop whose name is Hilary of Poitiers, who comes from kind of southern France. And he was an admirer of Athanasius and kind of wrote this definition for churches later on to follow. So yeah, that's where the Athanasian Creed comes from. But very good and useful, especially for understanding the Trinity. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we don't know exactly who wrote it, but it probably comes from one of these more local councils. And then once people started reading it, they're like, hey, this is really good. And then it was used, we know that it was used in basically like seminary teaching. It was never used as something to be proclaimed in church. If you tried to do that, it would take like 20 minutes or something. Like it's really long. And it's also like pretty like anathema on anybody who says such and such anathema on this, right? It's like, it's very pointed. But it is good. Like, it's just not really fitting for church. Anyways, so. All right, thank you for coming. Thank you for indulging me in saying this stuff. But if you have any more questions, come to me afterwards. But see you later to those of you online as well. Bye. Yeah, absolutely.